Lyn, did Elon Musk hurt institutional adoption of Bitcoin by saying it's not green?
I think in a small way possible, but I think the bigger picture for this kind of price action we saw is actually more tied to the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust. And so for people that are not familiar with it, the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust is, for a while been one of the only, publicly traded vehicles that you can access Bitcoin with for investors that prefer to access in a brokerage account. Institutional investors could also use it. And so in addition to people buying Bitcoin through that trust, there's also a neutral arbitrage trade there because it wasn't an ETF. It's still not an ETF. It trades, it's kind of like a closed-end fund. And so it can trade at a premium to NAV or a discount to NAV. And for most of its history, because it's a rather unique vehicle, it traded at a premium to NAV. And so what people could do was they could, buy in at NAV with these 6-month lockup periods, right? So the investor would go out, get Bitcoin, give it to Grayscale. They basically buy into Grayscale at NAV, regardless of what the current market price is relative to NAV, with the caveat being they have to hold it for 6 months. And so for some people, they just were happy to be long that fund, whereas other people did it specifically for the to collect the premium. And so what they would do was they do that action, get it at NAV, they'd short an equal amount of Bitcoin, and so they have a neutral position. And then after the 6-month lockup period, they can sell their GBTC shares. They can undo their Bitcoin short, and whatever the premium over NAV is, they get to collect that, and then they can do it again. They can do it every 6 months. And so when that trade's done, their trade's off. So they sold their GBTC, they ended their Bitcoin short, but Bitcoin is not redeemable from that trust. So that Bitcoin is permanently in the trust now. And so basically it converted liquid Bitcoin from exchanges into illiquid Bitcoin in cold storage. And so when that was repeated over and over again, it was kind of a Hotel California for Bitcoin. And so that was GBTC was the largest buyer of Bitcoin in the second half of 2020, for example. That's how big that effect was. And it's hard to know exactly what percentage of that was demand for Bitcoin versus specifically that neutral arbitrage trade, but certainly a component of it was that neutral part. And so now with GBTC having competition from the Canadian Bitcoin ETF, from some European exchange traded products, from easier, Skybridge Bitcoin fund, all these other things that are generally cheaper, Grayscale's now got a discount to NAV, and so that trade is over. There's no more kind of neutral arbitrage trade, at least in the long end. And so basically that biggest buyer is removed from the market. And so when we saw that happen back in, say, January of 2021, Bitcoin started to kind of consolidate for a little while, kind of made newer highs, but the momentum was kind of weaker. And then when you started to get that Elon, concerns, it kind of impacted a market that was already kind of, on its sideways consolidation. And so that kind of, helped trigger the decline. And so I think that played a role, but I think the more underlying thing was just a supply and demand balance for Bitcoin itself.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, and I'm not making this up, my next question after that one, I'm looking at it now. Did the end of the premium in GBTC signal a bear market in Bitcoin? But you did answer that. I am going to go back and push a little bit on the Elon and the green thing. Green thing. Uh, and I mean, you would know among institutional investors, they really look at ESG score. Some of this may trickle down more and more to family offices over time, and I would say likely will. Uh, it is going to be difficult, I think, especially now when things are a little rocky, to get institutional adoption. I mean, could Bitcoin be green? We would need to get in a deep discussion about, will there be a hard fork? Will the community allow it to happen? What will happen to existing Bitcoin? This may get interesting. If I could push you a little bit on the green initiative, could you paint a little bit of a bearish scenario to this?
Yeah, I think there's two separate risks here. So one is the how green Bitcoin is, and then the second one is how green Bitcoin is perceived to be and how that affects its investability. And so what I would kind of separate those two risks because I actually think a lot of the misconception, I think a lot of the kind of concerns around Bitcoin's energy usage are somewhat flawed. And so I actually think that the overall energy usage is pretty attractive, especially out of this after this recent move out of China, right? So I think it's actually going to improve. And so if you look at, say, Bitcoin's energy usage, it's something like 0.1% of global energy usage. And the way that Bitcoin scales, it'll basically over time use a smaller and smaller percentage of its market capitalization in energy. So even if the market capitalization grows, that percentage goes down. And so the absolute amount can go up, but the percentage goes down. That's what we've seen over the past 12 years and is projected out to continue. And so I don't really view that too much as a concern. But because we are in a very big wave of ESG investing, it's a really important part, especially for institutional portfolios.
For
I
sure.
do I do view that any perceptions around Bitcoin's greenness or lack thereof certainly can influence its adoption. And so, for example, we see one of the biggest new North American Bitcoin miners, Marathon. They were trying to, for example, deal with the fact that Bitcoin has transactions, and some of them, most of them were from legitimate sources, but you can always have some from illegitimate sources. And so they were trying to filter out some of the illegitimate ones to kind of improve its say institutional attractiveness. Now that didn't work out very well. They didn't really increase their demand for that, and retail investors pushed back on it. And so there are challenges in kind of making the overall ecosystem kind of this neat and tidy package for institutional investors to be able to use. But overall, I think it's kind of a separate thing between it's how green is perceived to be versus how green it really is. And so, for example, I know a lot of miners in the space or financiers that are using Bitcoin, for example, to soak up flared gas, right? So gas that would otherwise be burnt into the atmosphere is instead being put into Bitcoin. So that's basically using an energy source that would otherwise be wasted. And so there's actually a pretty significant percentage of the energy that's used for Bitcoin is increasingly kind of going towards that type of thing, in addition to stranded hydroelectric resources and stuff. So overall, but because there are still, for example, coal plants being used to mine Bitcoin in some areas, less so now that it's coming out of China, but we still have some, for example, in certain, say, U.S. states. I do think that's overall kind of a public perception concern, both from institutional investors and from certain politicians, like, for example, Elizabeth Warren or some of the other ones that have used that specific aspect of Bitcoin to kind of critique it.
Uh, I mean, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories too much, uh, but there maybe it's just coincidence. But all the things we're talking about, the China factor, Elon, we'll get to Kakistan in a second, uh, and knowing how central banks are, it almost made me wonder, is there a concerted effort to, I'm not going to quite say kill Bitcoin, I think that's impossible, but death by a thousand cuts and limiting its growth, if there was a coordinated effort, is very much possible. I don't know if that's more of a comment or a question, but I'd love to hear your general feedback.
That's a perception among some in the digital asset space, that we've had an unusually high volume of kind of government pushback against it. And so, you had some in the US, some in the UK. Binance, for example, is being increasingly,
Yeah.
regulated. China, they've had it's kind of a joke in the digital asset space that China bans Bitcoin every year, right? And it's always like, here's the Chinese Bitcoin ban of the year, and it never actually really has teeth. Yeah, I mean, it's been the biggest mining jurisdiction for I think at least 6 years now by far. But this latest one came from the highest level so far among those bands, one of the vice premiers. And so this one, we're seeing from the hash rate, and we're seeing from all the other evidence on the ground that this one actually is effective. So, very, very large percentage of Chinese Bitcoin mining is moving. They've also gone after some exchanges to basically try to sever it as much as possible from the banking system. They're probably trying to reduce competition to their new digital yuan, right? So they have kind of basically mining
For sure.
Bitcoin is a way for basically, non KYC coins from China. So it's basically a way that they can put in energy, get Bitcoin from nothing, not from existing exchanges, and then they could, potentially sell it away. And so they want to kind of limit some of those access points. But that's, of course, China. So in the United States and Europe, it's less extreme. We haven't had any sort of major actions to kind of, cut off Bitcoin from the banking system like you've seen in Nigeria or some of these other jurisdictions. But you have kind of like you said, death by a thousand cuts, bringing up ESG concerns, pushing back against all sorts of different, kind of aspects of it. And so I do think that there is kind of a somewhat of a pushback to kind of keep it in check to some extent, because it had this recent parabolic rise for the first time in its history. It's kind of a macro asset level, right? So as Bitcoin hit a $1 trillion market cap, as the whole space hit over 2 trillion, that's something that's now on more people's radars. And then especially when you have, corporations getting into it, institutions getting into it, it's certainly kind of it's hit the mainstream enough that I think that some jurisdictions wanted to keep it in check, especially ones that are, have somewhat less property rights, that are more kind of interested in capital controls or things like that. So we've had somewhat of a spectrum of pushback across the globe.